good afternoon, what is becoming an afternoon. So this is Words Between Words. And there's a story behind why we call it Words Between Words. So the title of the program is kind of written off on a song rather by Katie Herzig. It's called Midnight Serenade. And in this song, she says, there's a world between these words and how we use them. And then she adds, so don't confuse them. And we thought, well, why not? Let's talk about the world between the words and how we use them and try, while we're doing that, not to confuse them. Aisha, you here?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Oh, okay. Thank goodness. I mean, your computer did put us in a bit of a scare. So it's brilliant to see that you're in. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
All right, brilliant. Yeah, so I was just telling them about what we plan to do with the show, but also partly we wanted to kind of say, I suppose, a little bit about ourselves. So yeah, I think what I'll do right now is I'll just shut up and let Aisha say a few things about herself, and we see how we can take it from there. Aisha, you're on.
Hi everyone, I'm Aisha. I know Dikko from doing a master's in English literature at the University of Leeds. I did my undergraduate in classical literature and English, and I also studied Japanese and modern Greek. I enjoy every single time period in history, and specifically, I've done multiple modules on postcolonial studies.
And now, so we're gonna get into the text. Today, I decided that for the first text, we'll talk about Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. It's one of the first novels I got into when I actually got into reading anything that is considered a book in literature. So yeah, I read it a very long time ago, and I reread it maybe once or twice, but then I haven't revisited it for quite a while. So you can imagine that with the new things that I've picked up along the way, it now seemed like a completely different book. And I saw so many things that I thought, well, this might be problematic if you talk about this today. And I mean, I don't know what you thought, Aisha, because I know this is not typically something that you would normally pick up and read, or am I incorrect in assuming that? I know you love your Greek. So how did you find the text? Was it easy for you to get through the book, or no?
I think yes. Like I said, I did do postcolonial studies in my final year, and we did Nervous Conditions by Titi Dangaremga as well, which is a book set in colonial Rhodesia. I felt that was far more, how do I put this, problematic than this one. This one, just because of the way it was written, it felt less heavy. It flowed from one character to the next character and was very matter of fact about, violence in general. Like him drinking out of the skull of the first person he killed. It was very casually put. And because of the narrative tone, I didn't really feel it was difficult to read. It wasn't heavy. It was, yeah, I could see that that narrative tone being used to talk about, I don't know, a slice of life comedy. Like it was, it was easy to flow, like it had an easy flow.
I think the book gets that as a reputation, as in general, that it is kind of easy to read. And I think looking back, I can see perhaps why it was my first read, because I just kept going without knowing I was actually doing school. So if I had known I was doing school, I'd probably have put it down and go, oh my God, what are you thinking? That was, you probably should be doing something else. But yeah, I think the narrative style, as you explained, is just, it flows easy. It's very light. It's not so heavy. And another thing is in terms of the narrative style, there's this one thing I did like about it is how it kind of doesn't just go linear. It always goes back and forth. I mean, I think in the first few pages, if you're reading, you feel how Okonkwo is the narrative takes us back to Okonkwo's childhood, and then his kind of adulthood, but not necessarily adulthood, how he had to grow up so fast. And his growing up fast and his taking responsibility of what is happening in his father's household, taking care of his mom, his dad, and everything. But then as immediately that story is done, we also switch to Unoka's childhood. So we're told about Unoka, his childhood, and then to what he becomes. You find this a lot. I was kind of taking notes as I was going, and a lot of the time it was said, you would get the phrase, that was many years ago, that was several years ago. I think it just kind of indicates how the narrative is shifting from back to forth. It will tell you about Okonkwo, then come back to tell you about the present. It's like, that was many years ago. Now Okonkwo does this. Now Okoye does this. And yeah, I think part of what I love about narratives is that ease that you explain, that lightness that it has, unlike in poetry, where if let's say a poem is written to be this length as Things Fall Apart is, I think we would have a problem, because especially, well, it depends on what the language is, but someone like me, as I said, this was my first kind of introduction to literature, if you would, and I found it easy. But if I had taken up Homer or something like that, I probably wouldn't have done much with it, but place a plate on it or something.
Yeah. I don't know. Judging by how Achebe writes, I think even if you wrote it in poetry form, it would be easy to read, because there are poems that are easy to read, especially narrative poems, ballads.
Narrative poems, yes. But there's still gaps, I find, with poetry. Like if you take something like Michael by Wordsworth, right? It's something that is quite narrative, but still within it, you find that there are things that you expected to extract it in a way.
Yeah, you have to read between the words, which is sort of what we're supposed to be doing here. Prose requires it less than poetry, definitely. This is true.
Yeah. That's totally right. I don't know, because of the way time has kind of gone crazy. I just would like to see. Okay, we are at 12:26. One thing that I also wanted to get from you was, did you, while reading the book, was there a particular point at the book where you thought, well, this stands out as something familiar, or was everything just? I understand that literature in general kind of takes the familiar and makes it unfamiliar, but how familiar did it seem, despite the fact that it is fiction? Because that's another thing that we're dealing with fiction, not non-fiction. But how much did it resonate, even though it's a work of fiction? Because that's one of the things I was talking about with my students.
I think it's very realistic fiction. It is obviously fiction, but I don't know. It, again, because of the narrative tone, he could have said something outlandish and it would still have felt realistic, because he doesn't write very flowery prose. The way he writes is using very normal words, very grounded descriptions. So, I mean, even when he was talking about how the 9 prominent people in the clan were possessed by spirits as they were judging people, it didn't really read as bizarre or odd. It just felt like, oh, this is just a part of this world. And there wasn't really obviously, as soon as you read fiction, you have to suspend disbelief. You can't just, but there was nothing in the literature I felt that was like, oh, this is taking me out of this. This is unbelievable. I can't see this happening in this world that's been created. That being said, I think it is also really helpful that I have read texts that are set in this sort of setting. That was helpful because this didn't feel as alien as it could have. Because, well, I don't come from a background where having multiple wives or having people not live in the same house, that's not typical for me. But I've read enough and consumed enough fiction and literature that it doesn't feel bizarre it doesn't feel foreign. And I think that might be, it depends on the audience really, but for the most part, a Western audience would find this bizarre, especially the scenes where the missionaries are the outsiders. That scene especially would feel like
we are hoping to come to some of that more, how would I say, thematic aspect of the text after we hear from Dr. Brendon, because I do think what you're saying is right. The notions we get from the text would greatly vary depending on the audience who's consuming the text, if you will, from a Western reader to an African reader or somebody in the Middle East even. But I would like to introduce Dr. Brendon now to hear what he has for us on the cultural and historical aspects of the text. Dr. Brendon, I met Brendon in my MA program as well in Leeds. He was module convener for a module that I was taking, Africa's of the Mind, which was one of my favorite modules. And immediately I thought about this. I thought, oh, sure, we got to get Brendon in. And Brendon was so helpful to accept our invitation and honor us with his presence today. He is incoming director, as he told me, of Lucas. Lucas is Leeds University Center for African Studies. And I'm so glad to hear that, because I hope that in future we're going to be having more collaborations with Dr. Brendon. Dr. Brendon, today you're going to be addressing myself, but this content will be extended to staff as well as students in the Kaduna State University. So we're very glad to have you grace us with your presence today. And we're hoping to hear a lot of things that would hopefully excite not just us, but also our students and other staff, as well as the people online who are here today. So take it away, Brendon, all yours.
Dikko, can you hear me okay? And nice to see you, Aisha, and thank you everybody for having me. It's such an honor to take part in this, and such a joy, given that it's Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is one of the very first African literary texts I read, and made a big impression. And just like Dikko was saying, I come back to it every so often, and I'm amazed by the little details that I missed several previous times around, including things that have been mentioned today, like, for example, Okonkwo drinking out of the skull of the first person he killed, which somehow I missed on the first 8 readings or something, but was there. And when I reread last night, I think I'll start with some kind of very general things, and I also want to relate some of what I had to say to what Aisha and Dikko have been saying about the book. But start in a general way. It's a great book. It's a great book. Not only one of the best African novels ever written, but in my humble view, one of the best novels ever written. There's real craft in how Achebe writes. And just as Aisha says, it's engaging, it draws you in. The prose just seems to flow effortlessly. On the very first page is a sentence, and I'll read it out nice and slowly. The drums beat, and the flutes sang, and the spectators held their breath. Just as a sentence that just flows, it sings, and almost every sentence is that carefully crafted. As a writer, Achebe really, really knows what he's doing, but he looks as if it's just as natural as speaking to the reader. I think if we look at the difference that the book makes within African literature, we could go back to a figure like Tutuola, who publishes, slightly earlier than Achebe, and who is trying to do a kind of putting together of aspects of contemporary experience with aspects of folktale, and in a modernist way, really. And Tutuola, because of the way he writes, gets put down sometimes by the Nigerian educated elites themselves for playing into stereotypes of Africa. And if you read the back cover of one of the editions, the Faber edition of the Palm Wine Drink It, you will see some of the reviewers in the UK put on there things like, "This is fresh and weird, only an African could have imagined this." So we have a kind of stereotyping, even as a figure like Tutuola is accepted. And I think the difference that Achebe makes is that he puts African literature on the map in ways that refuse that very easy stereotyping. His project is equally kind of modernist, you know, in this novel, but he presents it in a way that is aware of needing to bring certain readers on board and also to counter prejudice with education, and education into something unfamiliar. You know, without Achebe, Ngugi would not have had you know, a helping hand into the publishing industry. I remember reading somewhere that Ngugi presented a play, spoke to Achebe, said, "I've got a novel," and Achebe put him in touch with the Heinemann African Writers series, if I've remembered correctly. So he's a towering, helpful, nurturing, mentoring figure. And this book establishes that stature and his kind of authority as an artist. One of the things I always have to say to my own students, and it's a point that's been made very, very valuably, this is a work of fiction. Some students who I've taught made the mistake of assuming it was a work of anthropology, or made the mistake of assuming that it was a direct history. And Achebe himself has said in an interview that he had to go back and imagine a time just before living memory to write the story. So it's a creative act. It's an imaginative act as much as it's informed and realistic and accurate. And some readers are perhaps not so careful and tend to assume that this is how things were before colonialism, or even worse, this is how things are now. And that, to me, you know, puts African communities just straight back in a kind of pre-colonial past, if that's the easy, perhaps lazy move that some readers make on occasion. Achebe's also said that, you know, as much as this is an historical project, and only fragments of the history remain when he sits down to address it, he also believes that fiction has to step into the gaps that perhaps the world or the history of colonialism has left as part of its legacy. So there's a kind of an active agency that literature makes available and that literature can undertake. It performs a certain action on the world. And you know, the novelist as teacher, one of his famous essays, gives some sense of, you know, the educational project of a story like this one. So Achebe sees the order within a novel or within a poem, he writes poetry as well, as corresponding perhaps to an ideal moral order that we can inhabit, all of us, and that we can learn from. So what I'm working towards is that the novel's inventing a community in history, and it's transforming the reader's, any reader's, relationship to the past. Achebe offers us an alternative order of knowledge about one part of Africa, Igbo land, in all of its subtle detail and in all of its cultural complexity. One of the things I love about the book is that it brings readers in. And one of the ways it does that is to allow readers their truth and the characters their truth, even where those truths don't coincide. It allows readers to sustain a little bit of doubt where there are events that they can't quite sign up to. And I noticed as I was reading through last night, there's just a brief reference to the cave of the Oracle of the Ekbala. And we're told that some of the members of our conquest community believe that there are dead spirits in the top of the cave, and you can hear them flapping about. And my instant thought was, how do I get my head around that? And then my next thought was, oh, this can be read as bats. And we're allowed both at the same time. And by allowing the reader their doubt, he allows us to enter and engage with seriously the certainty of the community that we're reading. Aisha mentioned the 9 elders of the village, the Egungun, and our suspension of disbelief as we understand a form of justice taking place, even though some of the people present might notice that one of them happens to have a springy walk like a Okonkwo. One of the things I always do with my own students is to get them to read that passage and then to write it from the perspective of a colonial explorer. And quite often they inhabit the voice really chillingly well. You would not believe the ornate and exotic prose that comes out of that exercise. And then the very next week, what I would do is get them to critique their own, critique colonial discourse as they've set it up. But what emerges from that is a kind of an understanding of the institutions of justice working as institutions in this community. And what I quite often say is, if you, it might be terrifying to see an Egungun with a mask on, but imagine in the Supreme Court, say in the UK, a judge wearing a wig. It's the same thing. It's the impartiality of justice as it is administered. It's not personal. There's a kind of donning of the persona of the law and of authority in both instances. The next thing I wanted to say is some of the less comfortable moments in the book for me are around Okonkwo's hypermasculine overreaches. I think it's integral to the story. He beats his wives, and he kills his own adoptive son when he's told to play no part in it. And some of the best critical readings are those that say there's a way of reading this heroic character as having a flaw. And his flaw is that he doesn't acknowledge either the space of the women around him and respect them, or the woman inside himself. So in other words, the idea that Okonkwo is a kind of imbalanced masculine figure who's deeply insecure and who tries too hard to be the man and the masculine authority he has to be. And part of his downfall is that the crimes he commits are deemed to be feminine crimes, accidental shooting of someone, hanging himself ultimately at the end of the book is considered to be a feminine crime. So there's a kind of unacknowledged element to Okonkwo, his own femininity, his own internal, integral femininity. And by ignoring that, he overreaches in the direction of hypermasculinity and brings about his own downfall, as much as colonialism is at play and does that additionally. So the lesson we can kind of take from that is that there is an idea in this book of balance, a balance between the male and female aspects of the self. We know at one point what Okonkwo doesn't like about his father. He thinks his father's weak. His father has no titles. He's called Agbala, which is another name for woman. And that detail there is being used to show us Okonkwo's hypermasculine perspective. But his outcome, I think, shows us the return of the repressed feminine aspects of Okonkwo's experience and of the institutions that properly belong to women in this community. And the most powerful woman that we see is Chielo, who is the priestess of the oracle of the Agbala. And who does Chielo adopt? Okonkwo's own daughter, Ezinma. And what does Okonkwo say about Ezinma? He wishes she had been a boy. Now, I think there what we get a glimpse into kind of the institutions of female power in the society, the earth goddess, don't commit a crime against the earth goddess because she will wipe out the whole family. And something like that happens by the end of the book. So there's not, it's not as simple as kind of casting the blame on one figure in this community for what happens with colonialism. But instead, his female crimes lead to his banishment, which is what allows colonialism to come in and take root, particularly the churches. And by the time he returns, he's no longer allowed to be one of those 9 elders, and therefore he cannot lead against colonialism. His act of, striking down a court messenger is an act in isolation, and what he represents is already outdated by the moment he does that. I want to speak about one final thing, which is, you know, we can read the book as a tragedy. You know, someone whose weakness is inseparable from his strength, someone whose downfall leads on from that. But I want to think the book through that dualism or duality. Achebe's, one of his favorite proverbs apparently was, where one thing stands, another stands beside it. In other words, this idea that there are always equal and opposite forces at work in the world. If you are too hypermasculine, the earth goddess steps in and balances things out again. So as lightly as we walk in the world, or as heavily as we stomp, there is always for Achebe an equal and opposite reaction at the level of history, at the level of identity, at the level of the gods too. And the title of the book, of course, isn't an African title. Initially, it's Things Fall Apart. It's taken from William Butler Yeats, and Achebe, at least in my edition, has got the beginning, I think it is, of that poem, which goes, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. In other words, Christians cannot hear Christ. I have lost touch with him. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Now, the end of that poem, we have a kind of rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, a kind of an antichrist figure. So we've had 2,000 years of Christianity. Humanity loses touch with Christ, and the exact opposite is born, a kind of an antichrist or the beast or something like that. And the idea of the gyre is that for Yeats, there were these little spirals in history, and they would build from a starting point, go wider and wider, imagine the birth of Christ, and wider the falcon goes, and then it collapses and goes in exactly the opposite direction. So kind of good and evil in a cyclical replacement of each other. Now, one way, of course, of reading colonialism in this book is that it and Christianity is that it builds to the point where something else is born. And that something else that is born is colonialism, with all of its terrible features and with all of its atrocities and degradations and injustices and theft and murder. And so we can go, and the colonization of people's minds. But that idea of the gyre also means that even as Igbo society collapses under the weight of colonial incursion, the seeds of something else are being born. And one way of looking at Okonkwo's death at the end of the book is that symbolically, at least, you know, the hanged man on the tree is very often used as a motif for Christ on the cross. Okonkwo has at times wanted to kill his own son Nwoye. What is Nwoye's name when he converts to Christianity? It's Isaac. And who's Isaac in the book? Isaac is Abraham's son. And Abram is instructed to kill his son, goes along with it, and then God intervenes. Okonkwo, by the end of the book, has possibly moved from being a kind of an Abraham figure to being possibly a kind of a Christ figure. And if we accept the idea of duality, where one thing stands, another thing stands beside it, it's possible to read the book not just as a tragedy, not just as a historical lead up to this awful event of colonialism, but also containing the seeds of how this community is going to go on. In a single step, we have a kind of an African Christ figure in Okonkwo that allows the community to live on and survive. The seeds of that story are also possibly running through Things Fall Apart, and possibly we have to look back, looking at what arrives, to make that other story, that emergent story of cultural survival, community survival, in a single step. The biggest earth-shattering, epoch-shattering event of colonialism is adopted within and moved beyond in this wonderful, broad, dualistic, balanced view of large forces in the world and in our characters. And that's kind of as much as I wanted to say. I've really loved engaging with Things Fall Apart again, and thank you for inviting me.
You're mute, yeah?
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, sorry. Yeah, no, that's very good, Brendon. I mean, that's some really, really excellent stuff. I mean, Aisha, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I obviously I didn't read it as a. When you said that, yeah, he does. He committed a female crime. I was like, oh, that is true. Because you're right. I like every single time I read it, I saw something new. Yeah, and I mean, I read it, but I hadn't really thought of it in terms of. I obviously, it's very obvious that he's hypermasculine throughout, and it definitely stems from how gentleness was his father's thing, and so he can never be gentle because that would make him like his father, and that's not anything he wants ever. But yeah, I hadn't thought of the fact that he had committed a feminine crime because it was so casual. It was so casually put that I didn't like. Yeah, but no, yeah, the duality, the whole you can be something and then you can become something else. In Becoming Animal by Deleuze and Guattari, they talk about how one thing can never inhabit the same space as anything else. So when you transform into something, you cannot ever truly transform into something else because the thing that was transformed already occupies a space and you cannot occupy that same space. So if he does in fact turn from an Abrahamic figure to a Jesus Christ figure, then yeah, I don't actually know what the connotations of that would be. Does he evolve? Does he become something new? Or is it just or is it just an attempt to say that I don't know. I wouldn't. I don't actually know what the implications of calling him Jesus would be.
No, I suppose. Yeah, Brendon, you want to come back in?
I'll tell you where that came from. Several years ago, I taught Arrow of God, one of his others, and I totally recommend it. It's just a brilliant book. And that's got a figure of a priest, and the priest is running a little kind of conflict with another priest called Ezidemili, who's the priest of Idemili, who we see in Things Fall Apart. Ezeulu wants his god, Ulu, to win. And so he has this little kind of competition for power with Ezidemili, who wants his god to win. And what happens is colonialism comes in and Ezeulu gets himself imprisoned. And it's his responsibility to give the community permission to harvest their yams. And if they don't harvest those yams on time, they're going to starve because the yams will rot. And Ezeulu does this kind of stubborn thing, believing that he is upholding Ulu's authority. And he says, I'm not going to allow you to harvest because I've been put in prison. That's disrupted my natural time frame, upholding the will of my God. And therefore, you cannot harvest your yams. And what happens is that Ulu, Ezeulu's god, strikes him down and incapacitates him so that the people can harvest their yams. And it's clear by the end of the book that the yams will now be harvested in the name of the sun, which could be Ezeulu's son, or could be the son in the biblical story, Jesus Christ. And one of the powerful critical readings of that moment is it's not really, the focus is not as much on the individual hero or their rightness or wrongness or their authority, but instead Ulu's prime interest is to protect the community. The community must survive. They're more important than any powerful figure in them. And so Ulu striking down his own priest allows Ulu just to reincarnate in a single step as the Christ figure in Christian story. It's like, in a single step, this powerful African god just, okay, I'll be Jesus then, and the community keeps surviving. And I've retro-engineered that story back into Things Fall Apart. They're very, very similar books. But that idea of, you know, the terms of community and its self-definitions are less important than its ability to navigate a very tough history, maybe. And so there's a kind of pragmatism of belief, if my half-baked theory is right, that allows us to see, you know, this bigger perspective of, well, you know, even the supposed large-scale story of Christianity can be repurposed in a single step by a belief system that's big enough to contain opposites and to work with them. And that's as close as I can get. It's still a half-formed thought in my head, and I'm going to have to be thinking about Deleuze and Guattari now. I can see quite clearly. Thank you.
Yeah, no, okay, that does tie in with the discussion that one of the elders was having with Father Brown, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown, yeah.
Yeah, about how the earth goddess works through messengers, and doesn't your God work through messengers as well? And that entire mapping on to the Christian system, mapping on. Yeah, no, yeah, yeah, there's something there.
Yeah, I think
Definitely.
that's what I was thinking. I don't know. There's perhaps a world where you can see that, I don't know, like that equation balancing, because like you said, when the village elder is talking to Mr. Brown, that does come up, and it does in some significant way also, I think, lead to what I want to talk about, which is the idea of colonialism and the stages of colonialism, basically, because in the initial stage, when Obierka, this is the first, I think, extensive mention of the white man in the text, right? When Obierka comes, when Okonkwo is in Mbanta, I think, his motherland, and he comes to see, Obierka comes to see Okonkwo, and when he comes to see him, he says, this is what has happened in Ameta, another village where they kill a white man, and what happens is, as retribution, the white man comes back with a number of people, and so many people are killed. And Uchendo, who is Okonkwo's uncle, says, well, these men are foolish because you never kill someone who never says anything. And the description that's given here of the white man is that the first one that comes is an explorer. This is the oracle, right? Because the people consult the oracle, and the oracle tells them that, okay, this is what is happening. The first one that comes is the explorer, is the scout. But what is more worrying to the people is that they're told more will come, right? Like, more will come. This is not where it's going to stop. Now, I'm interested to know, like, what do you think about the stages of colonialism, and does the book give like a conclusion that suggests even remotely that there's a possibility where we can see an end in sight for what is started, or is it just kind of, because this book was actually published in 1958. This is 2 years before independence. How does the book kind of create that understanding of independence? Is it something that will tell us today that it is settled that a country like Nigeria perhaps is independent, is not colonial anymore? Or does the book lay out kind of the institutions of colonialism that still today we have? I mean, you go to schools, they're basically not much different from missionary schools. It's just little differences that have made in the school system. The courts are the same. Brendon, you were mentioning robes and wigs. This is still the same thing that is happening in our courts here. But we've already seen that in the text. The elders give plaintiffs fair hearing, right? If you come with a case, you're allowed to say your piece, and the other person say their piece, and then a resolution is agreed upon. But those institutions have been ended, and now we have they still exist till this day. But how does the picture kind of portray that? Is it inclusive in its understanding or in its portrayal of colonialism and perhaps where it's going in any sense?
Aisha, do you want to pick up or should I?
You can go ahead.
I think there are a few things that kind of occurred to me when I was looking through again this time.
I think, Brendon, you may need to speak up. Oh, Brendon.
Oh, you got it. Okay. One of them is just the divide and rule of Christianity. We will set up our church in the evil forest. Oh, fine, do that, you fools, is the community's response. We will not kill twins. We will accept the Osu or outcasts. So, it gains hold by exploiting existing divisions within the community. And that, of course, means that you end up with a divided community, and divided communities are much easier to conquer. I think those divisions, we know some of the colonial legacies of division play out a few years later when Biafra secedes. Some artificial dividing up of governance structures, some artificial dividing up of communities along the lines of ethnicity, and the playing off of communities against one another is something that Achebe, he picks up on very, very early. And someone even says to him on the eve of Biafra, someone runs in and says, that book you just wrote, you predicted what's happening. And he said, what's happening? And the person said to him, war's broken out. So Achebe's, on the pulse of division and is in tune enough with how that division plays, I think, that he's also in tune with how history goes, even when he's not aware of what's happening historically. Does the book give us the seeds of something to go on with? I don't know. It's short. It leaves us in quite a bittersweet kind of place. We've got the colonial administrator reducing Okonkwo's entire epic life and everything we've just read to a paragraph. And of course, Achebe would be aware that as a writer, he inherits the English language. He'd be aware that that's also the price of being able to write the book he writes, is that colonial history that places him in a position to write in the first place. It's a very ambivalent inheritance to be to be working with, and I think he's probably aware of that. But I come back to that belief in duality and that belief in even the extension of grace where it's possible. Seems to be his kind of approach to working with large-scale divisive histories. He's always putting together, a figure like Yeats or a figure like Keats with someone that he knows from his own experience or someone who he can imagine from his own experience around him in his community, and finding something new out of that creative combination. Not totally sure if that answers your question. I think just in terms of justice in the courts, one of the things interesting things that's happening in a lot of the environmental thinking is that the residual institutions of colonialism that are inherited all over the place. In South Africa, we inherited English common law and Roman Dutch law, and then had the constitution that provided democracy for everybody. But those courts as institutions are now administering new forms of policy at the state level, including environmental policy, which tends to be kind of parachuted in and tends not always to be appropriate to the environmental challenges or opportunities on the ground in countries such as Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, pick one. So that kind of institutional legacy early on is, it's vital that Achebe mentions it, and also the corruption of the court messengers who take a premium on the fines that are meted out to Okonkwo and others. And that, I think, shows that justice, even if it has the same institutions, is not operating equally in colonial space. It's as open to abuse of power as anything else. And in fact, the Igwugwu from the scene we see, seem less open to that kind of abuse because everything's adjudicated publicly. And I hope that part answers probing questions.
Thank you very much. I am thinking of something else. So we have about 10 minutes left based on how we started, I think. So Aisha, do you have a question, or do we take a question from the audience or something else?
Yeah, we can take a question from the audience. I just wanted to say the way colonialism progressed in the text, it was exactly how monotheistic religions have been spread throughout the world. It first goes to the people who are not a part of the community in the first place. It appeals most to people who, you know, are seen as outcasts because their lives are better if they join a monotheistic religion that preaches that everyone is equal. And then the women join, largely because in a society where if they're treated like trash, they're going to want to live in a system that provides them with any form of equality at all. And then the nobles, like, you know, the young people, the young people who perhaps don't agree with all the injustices, join the religion. And new Isaac, he joins the religion because well, first off, his basically adopted brother dies, but even before that, it's because of the twins' cries in the forests that he hears. So to say that it's to say that missionary, like, you know, the church and everything is evil inherently is easy to do, but not perhaps the right thing to do, because it did improve a lot of people's lives. It wasn't from their own society that Christianity came necessarily, but that doesn't make it inherently evil.
No, yeah. Just on that, I think on how we would look back at the colonial legacy, or how it even started and then how it progressed. Like you said, I think if we look at it, I think the one thing that stands out for me, at least as a very unhelpful approach to the whole colonial question, is the nature of the communication between the two cultures that come into contact in this case. If you look at the way when Mr. Brown and the priest are talking, you know, both of them are very, very sure of their position. And I think we see this a little bit less when we consider things in literature, where we say, you know, don't always be so rigid and unmoving. You know, try to at least see it from another perspective and then try to explain it from there. So I think when the what's it called, when the elders go, including Okonkwo, to see the what's he called, like the chief commissioner or something, and he says to them, he says he wants to talk to them, but then he ties them up and locks them up, right? Communication always breaks down, and usually that's where the problem begins. I think it's that more than anything that really creates the kind of violent situation that we see.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it's late stage colonialism that has always affected colonial states worst. I mean, India was ruled for 200 years, but it's late stage colonialism that was truly like vile. Prior to that, it was either like there were benefits and drawbacks, but you know, they were in equal measure, probably. Like, you know, it wasn't just, oh, we're being oppressed for being oppressed for being oppressed. Initially, it was more of a give and take. It was a trade. And then late stage colonialism made them animals. So that sort of devolving of breakdown of communication is definitely an aspect of colonial history.
I kind of wanted to get one last, I wanted to throw this in and kind of see what you both thought. The book itself, Things Fall Apart, and I think we started with this right at the very beginning. The hyper masculinity that we talked about, we may not necessarily attribute that to Achebe. Of course, we wouldn't, because it's a work of fiction, and in literature you use it to explore things that are happening or whatever. But how problematic do you think it is today to publish a book like this? I ask this question because I think some months ago I was watching a video on YouTube, and Chimamanda was talking, and she says that she runs a creative writing class in Lagos here in Nigeria, and one of the students, who's a male, brings in a book that is just very, very, appallingly toxic. It was just doing all the things that you'd hope somebody would perhaps not say, and she kind of condemned his work. And I see a lot of this today, where you have people trying to revise literature that is written in the past. But now that we've kind of talked about how significant this text is, do you think a writer like Achebe today in Nigeria, or even anywhere really around the world, in the Middle East, in India even, would a writer who's well aware of what is happening in the world of literature be bold enough to write something like this today? And do you think Achebe at the time was perhaps even considering ideologies like feminism and how that would influence his writing in any degree, or it ended up influencing some of the things that he writes in this particular book?
I think making it a question of boldness is it's not a question of boldness, I don't think. I think it's a question of tastefulness. And at this point, we know people commit atrocities. That. This is not new. This is not news. So I think now having something distasteful is, taste change as time goes on. This would not be as, it's not like beating your wife doesn't happen right now. Domestic abuse is still a thing that happens in the world. It's not like, accidental deaths are commonplace. Children being killed before they're even named is common as well in many parts of the world. So it's not like as if these things don't exist, and pretending otherwise is a problem. But I don't think, as a general rule, people don't write like this. I think there's a weird echo chambery perception that people don't write this stuff anymore because no one can, no one should, we're not allowed to anymore. But people will write what they want to write, and I don't think we'll ever really have a world where we don't write about these things, because they're an inherent part of the human experience.
I'd add to that kind of Chimamanda, that's an interesting perspective. I was thinking of, before we chatted today, what are some of Achebe's kind of literary legacies? And of course, one of them is Chimamanda Adichie writing Purple Hibiscus, which begins with the sentence, "Things began to fall apart when," and that, I'm surprised to hear that she's perhaps more distant from Achebe than that first sentence suggested to me when I read the book. I think, she's gone and written the text of domestic violence, gender-based violence, awful events in that book. So I think, people can and do write about the stuff, including Chimamanda. I also think that we can't anticipate in advance some of the ways in which tricky material can be inherited and taken in a different direction. And there I'm thinking of Akwa Eke Emezi's Freshwater. and one way of thinking about that book is that she looks at the Azinma figure, you know, the Ogbanji, the spirit child, who has perhaps a masculine aspect, and is using those precedents in a, you know, a famous novel to take it in their Emezi's own direction, in the direction of the Ogbanji as a trans subject, or a gender fluid subject, or a multiple subject. I mean, that book just, you know, what they've written boggles my mind. So I think, you know, the gender-based violence, at least in my view, is inseparable from what happens to Okonkwo. It's shown to be his flaw, but there's not this editorializing, censorious language from Achebe, because he doesn't write like that. He leaves it there. We see it, we absorb it, and it makes sense as the novel progresses. And he's not giving it a free pass either, I don't think. Yeah.
I forgot his name. The kid that was being sacrificed. That kid. Huh? Ikemefuna, that's it. Him, yeah, his death does haunt Okonkwo, even though he really he probably definitely shouldn't have gone. But he didn't listen to his elder, who was advising him not to, and then he ends up being exiled. You know, like it obviously it's not causation, it's just correlation. But in a book like this, where correlation is causation, it's definitely you know, yeah, you're right, he doesn't get away with anything that he does, and it's not glorifying it in any way, and it's not sensationalizing it in any way, which is why which is why it doesn't read as, you know, distasteful levels of violence. It just feels like this is just a fabric of society, and it happens, and that he didn't think it was wrong is no reason for us not to think it is wrong. However, to say that it didn't happen is like saying that we've not progressed at all, because we've always been like this, which I think is problematic in its own way.
I did see just one question that popped in, and it's very, I don't know, it's just asking for a kind of a common ground between Okonkwo and the white man.
Perhaps as the novel progresses, a kind of militarism, and that's maybe where both Okonkwo and the white man are at fault. I mean, you've got figures like Brown and the other character who seem far closer to finding a middle ground. But I think with Okonkwo and his tendency towards conflict and his tendency towards temper, we're shown, you know, everything needed for conflict to go bad. It's what he's a warrior, you know, when we meet him, and a wrestler. But there's also within him an inability to kind of modulate his identity appropriate to the moment he finds himself in. So you know, we don't really get very many interactions between him and figures of the incoming colonial order, but definitely how he's represented accords with what the colonial order increasingly does. You know, as the book progresses. There's another question around identifying the fiction more than historical works, and I think, at least with Achebe, one of the things he does is he allows us to kind of see large-scale historical events through the lens of the personal and through the lens of wider wisdom and thought systems in this community, and I think that gives us a different kind of perspective on the history that happens, and I hope that's a sort of my best attempt at an answer to two great questions.
Yeah, and as for how many major themes do we have, there are as many major themes as ways to read the book, which is infinite, basically.
I might generalize a bit here, but I think story's a great way of getting us to buy into what we're working with or hearing or thinking about. Story as a form of what, you know, buying in our identification, our belief. And what's so clever about Achebe is he allows us our disbelief too. So it's a very, very subtle project that's almost designed to bring us in. And as much as I like, you know, history, there perhaps isn't that kind of giftedness or even the requirement to bring readers in. The parameters of the genre are perhaps different. For me, at least, history is more about the puzzles of what's not said, the information that's left out, the perspective you can't access due to the passage of time. Whereas fiction, as we know, in Achebe's hands, can try to bridge gaps and can try to make sense of historical events in ways that histories just can't, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, humans have largely kept their histories through storytelling. So storytelling is how we understand and what's the word? Frame history. It's how we gain our perspective on it. So I think it's the difference between saying 6 million people died and saying this person's cousin died, this person's mother died. There's a closeness to real people that you don't have when you see facts and figures in a textbook.
Yeah, thank you. That's good, Aisha. So thank you so much, Brendon, for joining us today. And Aisha, yourself, thank you. Any last words, Aisha, Brendon?
No? Thank you for having us.
Very, very much for having us. And thank you, everybody.